So sometimes you'll have your typical clients who maybe fit really well into a DBT model are people who are more dependent and demanding of their environment. They tend to be more emotionally vulnerable and wear their feelings on their sleeves, and they're always in crisis. Whereas there's another profile that you'll often see, which is people who suppress their emotions and keep them down, tend to be really self-invalidating of their emotions and self-critical, and give the appearance that everything is fine. And generally, it can sometimes be hard to fit these clients into a DBT treatment framework because some of the concepts that we often use don't quite fit. The main dialectic, right, the symbol of DBT, if you will, is this Venn diagram where we've got rational mind on one side and emotion mind on the other side. And the classic DBT borderline client that you would often see is somebody who primarily lives in emotion mind, right? They'll view the world through their emotional lens, big emotions. Sometimes they'll flip into rational mind and kind of cut off their emotions, get really rigid and judgmental, only to flip back into emotion mind. But there are plenty of clients who live mainly in rational mind and will sometimes completely lose control of themselves and flip into emotion mind. And these are the clients who will, let's say, come in. One client that just came to mind as I was doing final preparations is somebody who once came in and said, yeah, listen, I have problems with chronic emotion dysregulation. I lose control of myself all the time. And we say, great, we take a look at what's going on. And at some point during the intake, she shows me her schedule, and it's crammed full of classes in shiurim that she's giving, and shiurim that she's going to, and extracurricular activities. And she's super, super, super restricted in everything that she does, follows a very strict regimen. And like, sometimes I just totally lose it. There should be more chairs in the corner. If there aren't, you can grab from the other room down there. There's the room that we're not using. And sometimes I just lose it, and I've heard that DBT, I've done my research, DBT really helps keep my emotions in check, so I need to add more self-control to my problem, so I need skills to continue to control things. And so Thomas Lynch saw this presentation over and over and over again, and he came up with this concept of maladaptive overcontrol. So what is maladaptive overcontrol? And so he says that usually we look at self-control as a good thing, right? Like if you would look at, if you look at psychological well-being and self-control, you would think that the more self-control you have, the more ability you have to regulate your emotions, the better off you are psychologically. And he says, well, maybe not. Maybe actually it's good to a certain point. There's an optimal level of control, but if you keep having more and more and more and more self-control, you get to a point where it's actually not great for you, emotionally speaking, and it can lead to all sorts of psychological difficulties. And so he started looking at control as a personality construct, where there are some people who lean more toward over-control and some people who lean more toward under-control. Not that there's anything wrong with being an under-controlled or an over-controlled personality, but it's when you get to the extremes on either end that you kind of run into problems. And so he came up with, he came up with a system of looking at various disorders related to how they fall on the spectrum of control. When we think about the under-controlled disorders, emotionally dysregulated and impulsive, we've got borderline, antisocial, narcissistic, histrionic, binge-purge eating disorders. Whereas when you think about disorders that are more related to over-control, disorders that are more emotionally constricted and risk avoidant, you've got another set of disorders that lend themselves to that. So let's take a look at the biosocial theory of maladaptive overcontrol. How does this come about? So the first element here is the biological temperament. There are certain people who are just born with a temperament that lends them to higher degrees of overcontrol. So these are people with high threat sensitivity. So just biologically, by their nature, they're very, very attuned to anything that might be a threat. And anything unknown, anything unpredictable, there's a potential threat there, where somebody with a different set of personality traits might look at something unknown and unpredictable and say, wow, this is going to be really cool. I wonder what's going to happen, right? So somebody with this kind of temperament will go a different way. Low reward sensitivity, meaning that they're less sensitive to positive reinforcement of something. They're less drawn to something good happening. They view the world more through the lens of threat and avoidance than approach and reward. What can I get for things? They naturally have a higher level of inhibitory control, so they're just naturally better at, let's say, the marshmallow test. Those of you who remember from developmental psychology. So these would be the kids that would say, no, give me 2 marshmallows, and then not eat the 2 marshmallows, and then give me 3 marshmallows, right? So I can inhibit my behavior really well. In detail-focused processing, there's a tendency to look at the trees rather than the forest. This is in conjunction with a social element. So when you have this kind of temperament raised in an environment where we strive for perfection, mistakes are intolerable. Why did you only get a 95 on your test? Like what happened there? How could you do better next time to make sure you get 100? Always trying harder, always being prepared. It's never really good enough. We strive for perfection, but it's never actually put that way, right? We strive for excellence, which kind of means perfection. That's the subtext. Never showing vulnerability. There's no reason to cry. Everything is okay. Or social trauma, rejection, bullying, something that together with their high threat sensitivity turns social situations into things that are really, really unpleasant and scary. And what happens when you have this kind of personality, in this kind of environment, you've got all sorts of over-controlled coping that comes along with it. So people will mask their inner feelings because they've learned not to notice them. They're not really important. They're not things to pay attention to. They're not really open to new possibilities. There are certain ways that we do things, certain things that we ought to do. Compulsive striving, I always need to get better. I always need to do more. Nothing's ever good enough. Avoiding unplanned risks. So maybe I'll go bungee jumping, right? Because that's a planned risk. I can think about it beforehand and do it. But if I'm asked to speak at somebody's simcha, like next week, no. Yeah, I'm not going to do that. That's unplanned. Distress over tolerance. So I engage in approach coping rather than avoidance coping. I'll deal with whatever distress comes my way. I'm really good at that. And a superficial or distant style of relating, because if you can imagine somebody who doesn't go into unplanned, spontaneous social interactions or any kind of spontaneous situation, has a lot of difficulty with that, tends to push down what they're actually feeling, doesn't want to show vulnerability, it's going to be a challenge to really engage with somebody in a close-knit kind of way. So we've got the lack of receptivity and openness, the lack of flexible responding, lack of emotional expression and awareness, and social connectedness. And Thomas Lynch looks at this kind of personality and says, you know what the actual core difficulty is here that we need to address? This is a problem of emotional loneliness. And what we're going to do is we're going to focus on social signaling as a mechanism of change, right? So we're not going to look at about emotion regulation. We're not going to look at their thinking style or their core beliefs or helping them be aware of their emotions. We're going to help them by helping them change their behavior, in particular their social signaling behavior. Now, what's a social signaling behavior? Right, and the idea is in DBT we've got this tagline, life worth living. So in RO-DBT we talk about a life worth sharing. What's a life worth sharing? So the idea over here is that psychological health is composed of receptivity and openness to new experiences, flexible control, not over or under control, and intimacy and social connectedness. These are the 3 big things that we want to try and help people with maladaptive overcontrol learn. rather than staying safe by following the rules and staying safe by keeping your distance. These are the things that they've learned. If anybody wants the slides, please feel free to email me afterward, and I'll send the slides. Because this is what I've learned. This is what I've learned how to manage myself in life. And what we want to try to teach people is, no, a life worth sharing, meaning and fulfillment and purpose comes from the top three. And that's what we want to teach you. All right, getting back to social signal. What's a social signal? What is it? So it's any behavior that's done in the presence of others. And so here are some examples of social signaling. Smiling when you're angry rather than showing your emotion, over-apologizing, hiding your honest opinions, blaming, having a flat facial expression, speaking in a monotonous kind of voice, having poor eye contact, walking away from people when it's ineffective, being overly critical or defensive, giving people the silent treatment, picking your nose, getting defensive, folding your arms, flattery, indirecting. All of these things are behaviors that are done in an interpersonal context that send signals to the other person about who you are, about your desire to engage. And these are the things, say Thomas Lynch, that in order to help people with overcontrol achieve a life worth sharing, we've got to address. All right, so what does RO mean, right? We all know what DBT means, very nice. What's RO? So RO stands for a concept called radical openness, which stands at the core, is the core concept of RO-DBT. And we've got a couple of concepts here. One is this idea of encountering your edge, leading to engaging in self-inquiry. What does that mean? All right, what's your edge? So your edge is your personal unknown. And there are a couple concepts to keep in mind. One, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. Our biases, our experiences, our emotions, all of those things shape our perception of the world. And so when we see things, when we encounter the world, we don't see them as it is. We don't see objectivity. We only see our own perspective, our own bias. Yeah.
When you had that thing of the slide of oh gosh, just before the,
this one? This one? This one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Social signals.
Yeah.
Okay. This is obviously negative social signals.
Uh-huh.
We have positive social signals also.
Great point. Yes, we do.
No, okay. I'm just,
Yeah.
you know, because if those are the whole range of social
Right.
signals.
No, these are just examples. There are, right, and that's the idea, right? We want to...
Ones that are troublesome, that are
Yes.
difficult.
Yes, exactly, right? So
Push away.
making eye contact, smiling, right? Having a range of tones in mind, those are all positive social signals. And we all know, like, when you like somebody, when somebody makes a good impression on you, right? You can identify the social signals that they're giving off that draw you to them. Okay.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Okay. We don't know what we don't know, right? Our perspective is limited. We know the things that we know. And I mean, we know that there are things that we don't know ostensibly, but we don't know what they are. Because if we knew what they are, we would know them, right? So we don't know what we don't know. And the most important learning involves looking where we don't want to look, right? People like to read news sites and watch news channels that kind of agree with their perspective, right? That's how we get lost in our own bubbles and echo chambers and social media algorithms that just increase polarization. We like to hear what we already think, what we already know. The most important learning, though, sometimes is hearing perspectives that we disagree with. And that, in essence, is our edge, right? So sometimes we'll have encounter situations or memories of things that we're really embarrassed about, or that make us really uncomfortable, or topics that we don't like talking about because we get really riled up. That's our edge. When we feel misunderstood or invalidated or annoyed or resistant to certain ideas, that's our edge, right? We've reached the limit of what we know, the limit of what we're comfortable with, and right there at that point, that is our edge. That is our personal unknown. And the idea here is that rather than try to push it away or shut it down or prove yourself to be right, practice self-inquiry, which is the cultivation of healthy self-doubt. What is there for me to learn here? What am I missing? And over here, the key is not to accept quick answers. And the question sometimes is more important than the answer. Just being able to hold on to the question even if we don't have the answer here, right? So what is it that bothers me so much about this person's perspective? Why am I getting so upset? What do I feel when it turns out that maybe I'm wrong about this? Is it possible that something about how I expressed myself made people uncomfortable? What hurts most about what I'm being told? These are self-inquiry questions that are really, really important to engage in when we get to that point of our personal unknown, our edge. And that, in essence, is what radical openness is all about. This is a concept that's at the core of RO-DBT. When you think about people who tend to be very overcontrolled and rigid and not really open to new ideas and have a difficult time relating to other people, this is the central concept, the central skill that we try to impart. So radical openness is actively seeking the things that you find uncomfortable in order to learn. It's a willingness to be wrong with an intention to change if needed. This is a tough one for everybody. And understanding that there are other valid perspectives aside from ours. Right, that one sound familiar? Right? DBT, dialectics, validation. Okay, so what's the DBT in RO-DBT? So we've got this concept of maladaptive overcontrol. We know what that is. We've got this concept of overall concept of radical openness. Where does DBT come in here? All right, back to the Venn diagram, yeah? Okay, good question. Radical acceptance is the idea that things are as they are, right? It's the importance of recognizing when I can't change something for right now, and I'm noticing my own frustration, my own anger, my own behavioral trying to change the situation, and I'm working toward accepting that things are as they are, right? That's a skill that we have in DBT. It's a skill, well, it's a skill everywhere. DBT just gave it the name radical acceptance, right? It's related to radical openness, but it's different because radical openness is more about, control and is about where I'm encountering something that makes me uncomfortable. It's right, there's a self-reflective quality to it, right? It involves asking myself questions and opening myself up to going beyond my edge. Yeah?
If you have time, I don't want to interrupt your flow.
Yeah, I think.
Filling off your question, what's the difference between radical openness and radical genuineness?
What's the difference between radical open? I think again, there's probably an overlap. They're related concepts. Radical openness, I think, directly relates to this concept of identifying your edge, what your personal unknown is, where I'm getting uncomfortable, where I'm getting a little riled up, or really embarrassed or whatever, and moving toward asking myself about it and holding on to the question. There's an element of radical genuineness to it also. All these concepts are related, but it comes back to this idea of self-inquiry, asking myself those questions. Also, on your point of radical genuineness, one of the skills in RO-DBT, which we're not going to cover today, but it is called is the skill of outing yourself, right? So, like, if you're somebody who's really over-controlled and you're feeling uncomfortable about something, you're probably not going to say, "I'm feeling really uncomfortable." You're probably going to pretend that everything is okay. You're going to smile, and the idea of outing yourself also overlaps with this idea of radical genuineness. Being open with what you feel. Okay, so usually when we see this Venn diagram and we're talking about DBT, we've got emotion mind on one side and rational mind on the other side, and we have wise mind in the middle, right, which is the dialectic of both of them. In RO-DBT, we look at this dialectic in terms of control. So on one side, we've got fixed mind, and fixed mind is when I don't need to learn anything because I know the answer already, right? I know the answer. If I'm asked to give a talk at a conference, so I know that unless I spend 100 hours preparing and going over the lecture again and again and again, I'm going to make a mistake and I'm going to be completely humiliated in front of everybody and it's going to be terrible. And I know. So therefore, I have to spend 100 hours, right? And don't tell me I don't need to, right? That's fixed mind. I don't need to learn because I have the answer. On the other side of this dialectic, we've got fatalistic mind. And fatalistic mind is the opposite. There is no answer, so I'm just giving up, right? I'm asked to speak at a conference, and I say, like, there's no way I can do this without screwing it up somehow, and I'll be totally humiliated. So whatever, there's no point. I'm just not going to do it, right? So this is using control to insist that things have to be a certain way, and this is because I'm over control, just saying, forget it, there's nothing to do here, and just passively giving up. And what we have in the middle is flexible mind. And the idea of being in flexible mind is not being too sure of ourselves one way or the other, but being open to learning. Maybe I don't have the answer. Maybe there's another possibility here, right? It's somewhere between completely giving up and being completely fixed and sure and overconfident of what the answer is. And that's the place where we'd like to help over-control people get to. Another example of dialectics as they're used in RO-DBT, and this again is very similar to DBT itself, but one dialectic, these are dialectics related to the interaction between the therapist and the client, where one dialectical pole is from non-moving centeredness to acquiescent letting go. Non-moving centeredness is where, all right, here, this is the goal of what we're talking about today in the session. This is the work that we're going to do. This is, what's going on. And then on the other hand, acquiescent letting go. Sort of being able to put the agenda to the side and let's see what else is going to come up today. Let's see what else you'd like to talk about. What other issues might be related. So being able to hold on to the direction and the goal, and also at the same time making room to be able to let go. The other dialectic here is between playful irreverence and compassionate gravity. Compassionate gravity is the way, you could think about it as the way that we usually might lead therapy sessions. And thinking about people who have a tendency to over-control, this is sort of the place that you're usually pulled into as a therapist, because you're likely to reflect back what you're given. And so if somebody comes in and they're being really serious and really kind of low-key, you're going to reflect that. There's also a place here for playful irreverence, a little tease here and there, a little humor, being able to push a little bit where necessary. And so for the therapist, being able to shift back and forth as needed between these two poles is one of the places where the dialectic comes in. Another place where dialectics come in are the dialectical dilemmas that people who are over-controlled often face. These are dialectics that they struggle with in their life and that we bring into the therapy and help them figure out how to make sense of. So one central dialectic is the dialectic between dismissing their emotions on the one hand and relishing the negativity on the other hand, right? So there's at the same time a sense that emotions don't really matter because like what use are they anyway? They're just annoying. And at the same time, under the surface, really holding on to the negativity and basking in it. Why do that? Because there's something there. Because there's something because the emotion exists, and because it's something that sets me apart from people, and it makes me special, and it sometimes feels good to just harbor that resentment or that anger or that depression when I don't know any other way to manage it. Which relates to these two other dialectics. So one dialectic is between secret pride and isolation and shame. There's a sense of nobody gets me, right? And I'm in a way I'm proud of that. I'm proud of being unique and special, and people just don't get me People aren't on top of things as I am. People don't understand things like I do. That's why I'm so sure of what's right and wrong, and other people are kind of wishy-washy. The flip side of that is that there's a really strong sense of isolation and shame, because if nobody gets me, then I'm alone, right? No one's here with me, and there's a sense of shame that comes along with that. There's a sense of I'm different. Another dialectic that exists, dialectical dilemma, is on the one hand the tendency to self-sacrifice, coming from a sense of this is what I ought to do, this is how I ought to relate to other people. And I don't want to be dependent on other people. That's incredibly, incredibly scary and uncomfortable. The flip side of that is that there's a lot of underlying resentment and anger because I'm not allowing myself to depend on anyone. I'm not allowing anyone to be there for me. And so flipping back and forth between one and the other is a dialectical dilemma that the overcontrolled individual often finds himself in. Yeah?
Is it implied in dismissing emotions that that's like overly positive? Because if you have, or is that numb? Like, because I'm not seeing an opposite, like this relishing negativity. So it would be dismissing emotions and sort of someone that it's like, well, I have no negative emotions. Everything's positive. Everything's good.
So
Shaming everybody for not being happy or not being.
Sometimes that can be expressed as like this fake happiness, right? Like a superficial, shallow sort of happiness, and sometimes it's just like sort of like a calm, like no, everything's fine. Think of somebody who, let's say, just lost somebody very close to them, and yet is out there strengthening everybody else and giving chizuk and saying all these platitudes about how it's all for the best and whatever, when you can kind of tell that, like, come on, you can't really just be totally fine. So that would be another example of what it might look like. Okay. Similar to DBT, there's also a treatment hierarchy in RO-DBT, which will also look very familiar. So at the top of the hierarchy are life-threatening behaviors, meaning in any given session, if there are life-threatening behaviors that are there, this is what has to be targeted in that session. We have to take a look at this. So this is self-injury, suicidal ideation, or suicidal behaviors. That's top priority to address in the session. What's in the second tier? Anybody familiar with DBT? What comes next? Therapy interfering behaviors, right? So in DBT, we'll usually target the therapy interfering behaviors, things that people do that get in the way of therapy. In RO-DBT, we look at therapeutic alliance ruptures as second tier, right? And so we'll take something that from a DBT mindset might look like a therapy interfering behavior, but the way we'll frame it in RO-DBT is the client feels misunderstood or sees therapy for some reason as not relevant, or they're not engaged enough, right? And we'll see that as so like let's say if a client comes late, or a client is refusing to talk about what we had agreed that they would talk about, in DBT, we might see this as coming from, okay, they're stuck in emotion mind right now, and we want to help them move into wise mind. We want to target this as an emotionally based behavior, help them regulate themselves and address the treatment interfering behavior so that we can get back to treatment. In RO-DBT, we see it as a social signal, right? So if a client is coming late or doing something that is getting in the way of their treatment, our understanding of it is, okay, they're signaling to us that we're not on board right now, and that this is something that we have to talk about to help them get re-engaged or to figure out what went wrong here between us. And then the third tier is any behavioral related to over-controlled themes, like inhibited emotional expressions, behavior that's overly cautious or overly vigilant or very rigid, rigid and rule-governed behaviors, any behavior that's related to creating distance and being aloof in their relationships, or envy and bitterness. The treatment structure, similar to DBT, there's individual therapy, there's skills training, telephone consultation as needed. It's not mandatory, as it sometimes is in DBT, and in fact, in RO-DBT, they're rarely actually going to reach out. And then there's the therapist consultation meeting. Also similar to DBT are the diary cards that are often used. And what we have on the diary cards are suicidal behaviors and urges, what we call private behaviors, like beliefs, emotions, and sensations related to overcontrolled themes that are also related to social signaling target behaviors. Self-inquiry questions. So radical openness is something that's constantly discussed and brought up in this idea of going out into the world this week and coming back with a self-inquiry question, finding a situation that made you embarrassed, uncomfortable, angry, upset, and bringing it back in and coming away with a question. What can I learn about myself from this incident? And keeping track of what their valued goals are. Keeping an eye on what you're looking to gain from therapy and what you want your life to look like. Chain analyses are also used primarily for social signaling behaviors. And you want to choose the one that is the most important in terms of blocking their valued goals. So let's say, if the client is keeping track of certain social signals that you've spoken about in session, and they come back and there have been a few of them. So the one, let's say with their spouse, if they've identified that as their most valued relationship, so you talk about what happened there in the session. And unlike in DBT, we won't use chain analyses as an aversive contingency, right? So for example, in DBT, if something goes wrong, we'll sometimes use the chain analysis in order to not just dismiss what happened. Well, let's bring it back and let's go through this in detail, this behavior in detail, in order to figure out what happened, in the way that the client doesn't necessarily like. And the goal for doing that is to sort of is to extinguish this, or not extinguish, whatever the behavioral. Shamsi, what's the behavioral word? All right. In order to extinguish this behavior that can be problematic. In RO-DBT, we wouldn't do that because the clients tend to be less impulsive and less spontaneous, and things tend to be more thought out. So we'll address the behavior head on and talk about it as a social signal. Yeah. So you would, because that's the top priority, right? So if there's a self-injurious behavior and a whole bunch of social signals, you talk about self-injurious behavior first. So I don't think we would see it as an aversive contingency in that way, because presumably we would have a discussion about how your values pertain to self-injury. And this actually can sometimes be a valuable discussion, because right from the outset, if I'm overcontrolled, I place a great deal of value on controlling my behavior, and I have to self-injure. If I mess up in a certain way, if I make somebody feel bad, I have to hurt myself, because only then I'll learn, right? So rather than, we see it a little differently, rather than it being this more spontaneous and impulsive act aimed at regulating my emotion in the moment, it's something more deliberate, and it's something more, the self-injury is something more deliberate and planned and has a function of future behavior change, right? So we'll treat it that way. We'll have a discussion earlier on in therapy about, is this really working for you, right? Do you want to continue adopting this behavior of hurting yourself in order to change your behavior? And maybe early on that might be a self-inquiry question, right? Does this actually work? You're so sure that it does that you must be cutting yourself in order to act nicer toward other people. Is that true? Okay, RO-DBT skills, and we actually have a couple minutes to go over this. Great. So a couple differences between the skills. The skills in RO-DBT are conceptual rather than practical, right? If you think about DBT skills, most of them are about, okay, here's what you do, right? There's something to do in this situation, there's something behavioral to hold on to. In RO-DBT, it's the opposite. It's not behavioral, because people who are overcontrolled tend to be really good at solving problems and figuring out what behaviors to do. The skills are more conceptual. They're more new ideas that we want to encourage people to keep in mind. Another reason why they're not behavioral is because there's no need to get caught up in detail, right? If you somebody who's really overcontrolled, if you give them a DBT skills worksheet, so they look at the tip skill, right? Exercise. Okay, so do I tense up my arm muscle before my leg muscle? Exactly how many seconds do I hold my breath for, right? How is it supposed to work? Right? The point is not the details. The point is the idea. And if you don't know if you're doing it right, great. That's the point, right? Do it without knowing if you're doing it correctly. In terms of distress tolerance, which is one of the modules of skills in DBT, so there are no distress tolerance skills in RO-DBT, primarily because people who are overcontrolled tend to, on their own, be really good at tolerating distress. The only exception to this is a skill that we call activating social safety. And we have this because the interpersonal component is really the most important component in terms of helping people connect because of our perception of the problem of overcontrol being related to emotional loneliness. And so let's pause that. We'll get to it in a couple of minutes. Emotion regulation skills. So we don't have emotion regulation skills. We do have skills that are related to emotional openness and awareness. And the main emphasis in RO-DBT skills is on openness, connection, and healthy self-doubt. That's really where the money is in RO-DBT. Okay. Also, RO-DBT skills are not divided into modules. I've divided them into modules just because I'm very overcontrolled and I need things to be very, very organized. So I did it, but officially, Robert Lynch did not divide them up. So here, in mindfulness, I'm not going to go through each of them individually now, but just to give you an overall idea, right? We've got the observe, describe, and participate, but we'll look at them a little differently. So we'll talk about OC states of mind, which is the Venn diagram that I showed you earlier, self-inquiry and healthy self-doubt, which we talked about, observing open-mindedly, right, with an emphasis on openness, describing with integrity, which is not getting caught up in not judging and getting every single detail, but being true to the general object. Participate without planning. So a participate without planning exercise would be to let's say, if I'm not going to do it now out of the interest of time, but it would be fun to do it. If I said, okay, everybody stand up, right? And everyone's standing up and kind of looking around like, hey, what are we doing? Okay, now everybody give like a big hearty laugh. Ha 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 ha, we all do it together. Now let's give ourselves a big round of applause, right? And we just do something completely ridiculous. And we just sort of like let it go. And the idea here is not necessarily exposure to being vulnerable, to being silly, but it's the idea of all of us sharing this experience, coming together spontaneously as a group of people, right? And just having that experience. It's something that's incredibly, incredibly difficult the more over-controlled you are. And it's an amazing skill to be able to have, to be able to learn how to engage spontaneously as a group, doing something that doesn't quite make sense.
To groups?
Sorry?
But is that tool exclusive to groups?
It's done in groups. It could also be done in individual therapy, just you and the client together, but it doesn't have the same kind of power. Awareness of harsh judgment, right? We're not trying to not judge. We're not trying to counter the judgment. We're just being aware of the judgment, and one mindful awareness. Then we've got openness to experience, which is understanding over-controlled coping, understanding how it develops, the idea of allowing discomfort, emotional discomfort to exist, doing new things, doing things in new ways, and allowing yourself to learn from feedback without getting caught up in pushing back. Emotional connectedness is about understanding emotions and understanding the purpose of emotions. Overall, what you're feeling. Generally, you don't have to pinpoint, am I feeling fury or just irritation, right? Just in general, like I'm feeling upset. Talking about envy and resentment, because that's usually very wound up with the social milieu. as well, and behavior and social signaling, as well as cynicism and bitterness. Social openness, we talk about the importance of connecting with people as a tribe, the idea of kindness first and foremost in terms of relating to people, loving kindness meditations as a way to enhance openness and connection, the role of social signaling in building trust and connection between people, and how social signaling actually helps you live by your values that you want rather than keeping your distance and staying safe, the role of trust and dependency, learning how to do that, and self-disclosure related to outing yourself or radical genuineness. Interpersonal effectiveness, so these are also in a way parallel to DBT skills, saying what you mean, being assertive with an open mind. So assertiveness doesn't mean I must have my way or else. It's having the dialect of being flexible. Validation as a way to signal social inclusion, and how to deal with defensiveness on the part of yourself, on the part of others, and forgiveness. What that means. That's often a very novel concept to people who are over-controlled. Okay. Any questions, comments? Yeah?
I'm wondering about the safety component when we're working with trauma survivors and using this model. How do we assess what the client's level of safety is using this model to ensure that it's the right, like when would you say would be the right time to bring it in? How do you assess for that? What would this model say about assessing for like safety?
So when you talk about safety, are you talking about the client's current level of safety in their life or their felt experience of safety?
Internal and external. Like, I guess I was thinking about like soldiers, and if we're working with PTSD, like how would a model like this, or if someone has complex PTSD, how would we integrate understanding where they're at safety-wise with using this model?
So I think that a lot of it starts from early on in the therapy process. Like when you're talking about conceptualizing and what therapy is going to look like, and what our goals are in the treatment. Is this person ready and willing to identify over-control as the thing that they want to work on? Because if I'm really, really stuck in that traumatized place, and the issue that you're identifying as a therapist isn't necessarily a personality trait of over-control at its core, but rather trauma at its core. So maybe I don't necessarily want to go into this right away, right? Maybe I want to help the person have some more internal resources before we go into, okay, let's help you connect with other people, especially if there's been some really, really serious social trauma and they're not really ready to connect with other people yet. So that might be something that you'd have to assess in the beginning. Yeah?
Yeah, I'm just curious if you could speak more to the resistance. I can imagine that these clients are very resistant to hear that there's anything wrong, especially socially with them. Not like wrong, but just like maybe that's not the right way to, like, is it more of an approach of you come to that yourself, or is the therapist like reflecting that back to them?
So we want to start by talking about over-control in terms of like, there's a personality trait of how under-controlled or over-controlled a person is. You know, what do you think? And we have this checklist that I can also send out in the email of under-control traits or over-control traits, right? And sometimes we can give it to a client and say, which one, like check off the ones that fit you, right? And they're checking off all the over-controlled ones. And then we talk about this concept of over-control or under-control and the differences between people, and the person could say, well, actually, yeah, like I sound kind of more over-controlled. And then like, okay, so people who are over-controlled often experience, you know, this and this and this, and we can talk about how relationships go overall. And usually people will acknowledge that they have some difficulty in relationships. Like if somebody has some real difficulty in relationships but has no clue, so you might want to start from that. But this is what you would do once you have that alliance that you've built of like, you value relationships, you want to connect with other people, you have a hard time doing that. Okay, yeah?
I'm going to know, has any work been done with this in the autistic community, the high functioning Asperger community?
Yes. Yeah, so there is work done with the high-functioning autism community. I'm not completely familiar with the research, but often I've brought this in my work in terms of like identifying the social signals and being clear with what behaviors are, and teaching people a new set of behaviors can sometimes be really, really helpful. The self-inquiry thing is difficult. It takes some time, but yeah, there's a lot written on how this work is applied to that population. For this, yeah, so I can show. Sorry? I'm sure there are. I don't know of any books offhand, but if you just look on Amazon, I'm sure there is. There it is. So that's my email. That's my phone. You feel free to be in contact by email or WhatsApp if you want the slides. Thank you very, very much.